This is Think Out Loud on OPB. I'm Jen Chavez, and we turn now to water. That's the focus of a new study from the University of Washington related to the 2001 Roadless Area Conservation Rule, also known as the roadless rule. For 25 years, it's prohibited new road construction and intensive logging on nearly 60 million acres of federal forest land, including 2 million each in Oregon and Washington. Now, as the federal government works to repeal the rule, researchers are calling attention to how that might affect drinking water sources on that land. To learn more, we're joined now by a co-author of the study, Michael Dombeck. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. He also helped develop and implement the roadless rule as chief of the U.S. Forest Service from 1997 to 2001 during the Clinton presidency. Michael Dombeck, thank you and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
So before we dive into this study about drinking water, I'd like to learn a little bit more about the roadless rule in general. As I just said, you helped implement the rule and your role with the U.S. Forest Service. Why was the rule created in the first place?
Well, Jen, there are really two major areas. Number one is the economics of it, and number two is the environmental values, which the study on water addresses. But just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the rule, and we have 193 million acres in the National Forest System in the United States. And after World War II, timber harvest ramped up significantly for obvious reasons. We needed wood for the war effort. And then, of course, the post-war housing boom put an additional demand on the wood. And by the late 1980s, we had 380,000 miles of roads on the National Forest System. That's enough mileage to go to the moon and halfway back. And just, another metric to compare it by is there's about 46,000 miles in the interstate system. And it costs money to build roads, and it costs money to maintain roads. And once the large high-value timber was gone, that literally left the Forest Service holding the bag of about an $8.6 billion backlog in road maintenance, which is little more than a taxpayer liability, is exactly what it is. So, plus the controversy associated with going into roadless areas was intense. So I was sort of left holding the bag when I became chief of the Forest Service and asked myself, what would a private woodland owner do? What would a corporate timber company executive do? Well, obviously, you need to slow the system down. So we really put a moratorium on road building initially, and we saw the public support behind that. And at that point, the administration and President Clinton asked us to what we could do to make this permanent. So that really led to protecting 58 million acres of land from building new roads, from commercial logging. And that rule has been in place since 2001.
Mm-hmm. And, there was a lengthy process and a period of time in which this rule was being developed. During that time, what was the general reaction or sentiment towards the rule that you all got from the public?
Well, when we first put the proposals out there, we held over 600 public meetings. Really, the process was an 18-month-long process that generated an all-time record of 1.6 or so million comments from the American public, with 90% of those comments supported protection of roadless areas, and they, in fact, called for more restrictive measures than the rule originally called for, or the proposal that is originally called for.
Mm-hmm. So now, as the Trump administration seeks to rescind the roadless rule, I know one of their main arguments for doing so is that it'd make it easier to fight fires. We just spent a couple minutes hearing about fires in the Northwest. One part of that argument, I think, is that more roads would make fires easier to access, and two, that an increase in logging would allow for better forest management, including thinning out potential fuel for fires. What do you make of those arguments when you hear that reasoning?
Well, the first point is on the level of fuels available. You know, fire requires fuel, oxygen, and heat. And of course, it's largely driven by weather, as the earlier guest had just described with the dry lightning strikes. But we do need vegetation management. That's very important in reducing fuels where we can, because we're really dealing with, you know, nearly 100 years of fire suppression, which we today all agree was not the right policy. So we had fuel buildup, so we have more fuel, drier conditions, the influence of climate change. So we're having more intense fires. In fact, the fires today are a magnitude worse in many cases than they were when I was chief and I retired in 2001. So vegetation management is important, and we really should be talking about vegetation management to reduce fuels and do work in these areas. And the second thing I would address is that overall, the data for the last 25 years or so shows that most fire ignitions occur within a quarter of a mile of a road. In fact, if we look at the rate of fire ignitions per 1,000 hectares in wilderness areas, we see the ignition rate of about 1.7 fires per 1,000 hectares. In roadless areas, it's about 1.9. And in areas near roads, it's 7.4 fires per hectare. So uh, the bulk of the fires are really human ignitions, human caused within roadless areas. So while uh, fighting fire in very remote areas is a real challenge, the highest probability of fire is where we have interactions of humans and roads.
If you're just tuning in, we're talking right now with Michael Dombeck about a new study out from the University of Washington focused on the roadless rule. It focuses on how it relates to watersheds that serve as a source of drinking water. And Michael, I do want to get into that now. So this study you've co-authored focuses on how the roadless rule protects watersheds that produce drinking water for millions of Americans. And I know this took a nationwide look and found, for example, that a lot of people get drinking water from watersheds in these areas in states like California and Colorado. Could you tell us what this looks like in Oregon and Washington? Do you know how many people get drinking water sourced from these areas in our region in the Northwest?
Well, yes, and first and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge the University of Washington, the leadership they provided, conservation science partners, and the leadership that they provided, and the co-authors who really dug in very deeply using the most up state-of-the-art science to look at this. And what we looked at was we looked at almost 2,500 watersheds across the United States and some 80,000 stream miles and how that influenced the drinking water supply. And what we found was that over 25 million Americans drinking water using public water systems get cleaner water because of the basically because of what Mother Nature does in water filtration, percolation of water into uh, aquifers, the replenishing the groundwater table and downflow water from filtration that Mother Nature does for us. If we take a look at Oregon specifically, what we see is that 91% of the roadless areas in Oregon, about 1.6 million acres, are in municipal watersheds, and they provide water for about 900,000 people in the state of Oregon. Cities like Salem, Baker City, Lake Oswego, Pendleton, Ashland, Eugene, Bend, and many others get their water purified, and much of it sourced from these roadless areas. Uh, and about the same proportion in Washington is what we see. So we get clean, clear water. We don't have to spend money on water filtration plants. What we need to do is we need to allow Mother Nature to do the work for us.
And yeah, you have spoken to how Mother Nature has contributed to the health of these watersheds. So I'm wondering if the roadless rule is to be rescinded, and road construction and logging began in currently protected areas, what kind of effect could it have on watersheds?
Well, what we see, especially in steep backcountry, rugged terrain, is we see uh, sedimentation increase, landslides, sedimentation into streams, reduced water quality because of the unstable soils in many cases. Remember, this is steep mountainous country that we're talking about. So when we get storm events, we get oftentimes intense soil erosion and degradation of habitat. For example, some of the national forests in Oregon have some of the last remaining populations of bull trout. The reproductive habitat, the spawning habitat of many salmon species is dependent upon good stream conditions, clean water, and many of the headwater streams that feed the major rivers are relying on roadless areas because, again, these are undisturbed areas that provide a clean, steady source of water. The thing to keep in mind is what these areas do is they catch, store, and release water over time, and that's so important in damping the effect of floods and increasing flow during drought periods.
Thank you for getting into those species of animals as well. You kind of read my mind with the next question I had for you. I know that this study also focuses on aquatic biodiversity. So great that you have highlighted that too. I just want to ask you kind of as we come to a close, you, as we've talked about, are someone who helped create the roadless rule 25 years ago. And I wonder, what has it been like for you personally to watch things unfold in the last year, recent months, where the current administration is seeking to roll it back?
Well, it's a bit puzzling because it's hard to identify a constituency that supports the rollback of the rule, given the level of support that I mentioned earlier for the rule. And in fact, the opposition to repealing the rule was something like 80% in the last go around here, just within the last year when the administration first put the proposal out. But in a sense, it's a problem looking for a solution. And given the rate of development of land in the U.S., I believe it's so important to maintain the last backcountry wild places that we have. We're dealing with something like the development of 6,000 to 8,000 acres per day in the U.S., and that's wildland, forest land, farmland, wetland being subdivided into more intensive uses. So it's important to keep things the way they are. In my view, it's a very conservative policy. Number one is it doesn't cost the taxpayer money by building roads. Number two, it doesn't create a long-term liability and cost of maintaining the roads once they're built. And number three, it keeps options open for the future. And it provides some of the best hunting and fishing opportunities in the country are these wild backcountry places that belong to all Americans.
Well, Michael Dombeck, I know we will continue covering this at OPB, particularly through the work of our wonderful climate and environment team here. And I just want to thank you very much for joining us today to unpack all of this and share about the new study. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up after a quick break, we'll learn about the WA Cares Fund, about WA Cares, a first of its kind state-run insurance program for long-term care for older adults.